Elena Voss wasn't used to being told no. Not because she demanded her way, far from it, but because she'd spent the last 12 years building something real, something respected, something that earned her a quiet kind of authority. She didn't wear flashy suits or drop names at parties. She showed up early, listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, people paid attention. That morning, though, none of that seemed to matter. It was just past 10, and the sun slanted through the tall windows of the First Meridian Bank branch on Elm Street. The place smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner, the kind of sterile calm that banks try so hard to project. Elena had come in person because the transaction felt too sensitive for a wire. She needed $15,000 in cash, enough to seal a handshake deal with a small hardware manufacturer in Detroit. The kind of supplier who still believed in face-to-face trust, who didn't want digital trails for a prototype run. It was old school maybe, but it was honest, and Elena valued honesty more than convenience. She approached the counter with her usual calm. She smiled at the teller, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Tina. Elena placed her ID and bank card on the counter. "Good morning," she said. "I'd like to make a withdrawal, $15,000, please." Tina blinked. Then she looked again at the screen, then back at Elena, then down at the account number. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. 15,000? She repeated, voice rising slightly. "Yes," Elena said gently. "All in hundreds if possible." Tina swallowed and turned to a colleague behind her. A moment later, a man in a slightly wrinkled navy blazer appeared. Derek, the branch manager. He had a practiced smile, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, stepping forward, "I'm going to need to verify a few things before we can process a request of this size." "Of course," Elena replied. She pulled out her phone and opened her banking app, showing her current balance well over 6 figures in her personal account alone, not counting the corporate holdings tied to her business, Nova Edge Technologies. She even offered her business license, her driver's license, and a recent utility bill. "I'm the account holder," she said, keeping her tone level. "This is my bank. I've been with First Meridian for over a decade." Derek nodded slowly, but his expression didn't soften. "We appreciate your patience," he said, glancing at Tina, who had gone pale. "But our system flagged this transaction as potentially high risk. Unusual activity." "Unusual?" Elena asked, a flicker of disbelief in her voice. "I've never withdrawn this much in cash before, no, but I've wired far larger amounts without issue. And I'm standing right here in person with full ID." "I understand," Derek said, folding his arms slightly, "but policy requires us to hold the request for review. It could take 24 to 48 hours. Elena stared at him. "You're telling me I can't access my own money? In my own bank? When I'm standing right here?" "It's for your protection," he said quickly, as if reciting a script. "Fraud is on the rise. We have to be cautious." She felt a hot prickle behind her eyes, not tears but the sharp sting of injustice. This wasn't about fraud. This was about someone behind a screen deciding that a woman walking in alone, asking for cash, didn't fit their idea of normal. She'd seen it before, the subtle hesitation when she walked into investor meetings, the way people assumed she was the assistant, not the founder. But here, in her own bank, where she'd deposited her first paycheck from her startup, where she'd celebrated her first profitable quarter with a modest transfer to savings, she took a slow breath. "Let me be clear," she said, voice low but steady. "I'm not asking for a loan. I'm not requesting a favor. I'm asking to withdraw money that is already mine. Legally, fully, completely mine. And I'm doing it in person, with verified identification. There is no fraud here. Only your system's assumption." Derek shifted his weight. "Ma'am, I'm just following protocol." "Then your protocol is broken," she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her hand on the counter. But something in her tone made the room go quiet. Even the hum of the overhead light seemed to pause. A few other customers glanced over. One older man near the door frowned slightly, as if he'd witnessed something wrong but didn't know how to intervene. Tina looked down at her desk, unable to meet Elena's eyes. Elena gathered her things slowly. She slipped her ID back into her wallet, zipped her bag, and straightened her coat. "Fine," she said. "Hold it, review it. Do whatever your system tells you to do." She paused, then added, "But remember this moment, because I won't forget it." She turned and walked out, the glass door hissing shut behind her. Outside, the city buzzed. Cars honked, people chatted on phones. A street musician played a soft tune on a saxophone. Normal life, moving on. But inside, Elena felt something shift. It wasn't just anger. It was clarity. She got into her car and sat for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. She thought about the supplier in Detroit, how he'd stayed up late to review her designs, how he'd trusted her enough to hold the production slot without a deposit. And now, because of a rigid algorithm and a manager more afraid of breaking rules than losing a customer, she might have to go back empty-handed. But worse than that was the feeling of being invisible. Not as a CEO, not as a business owner, but as a person. Her history, her integrity, her decade-long relationship with this institution, none of it mattered when the system decided she looked risky. As she drove back to her office, she didn't call her lawyer. She didn't post on social media. She just thought. And in that quiet space, a plan began to form, not born of rage, but of resolve. If they wouldn't see her for who she was, she'd make sure they couldn't ignore what she represented. By the time she parked in the underground garage beneath Nova Edge's downtown building, her mind was already working. She rode the elevator up, nodded at the security guard, and walked into her office. On her desk sat a framed photo of her first team, 5 people crammed into a tiny co-working space laughing over burnt coffee. They'd built this together. Every dollar in that bank account had a story behind it. Late nights, tough decisions, risks taken, and lessons learned. And now, someone had treated that story like a red flag. She sat down, opened her laptop, and typed a single sentence into a new document. Access denied. Not acceptable. Then she picked up the phone and dialed her CFO. "Hey," she said, voice calm again. "Can you pull all our account details for First Meridian? Personal and corporate. I need a full snapshot by noon." There was a pause on the other end. "Everything?" "Everything," Elena said. "Because if they don't trust me with my own money, maybe it's time I trusted someone else with it." Outside her window, the city kept moving. But inside, the first domino had already fallen. Back in her office, Elena didn't slam doors or raise her voice. She didn't need to. The quiet disappointment she felt was heavier than any outburst. She sat at her desk, the morning's encounter replaying in her mind like a glitching video, each frame sharpening her focus. Something wasn't right. Not just inconvenient, not just frustrating, but wrong. And if there was one thing Elena had learned building her company from a garage project into a respected tech firm, it was that wrong often had roots deeper than it first appeared. She opened her laptop and logged into her personal banking portal. The numbers were all there. Steady deposits, minimal withdrawals, balances that reflected years of disciplined growth. She clicked over to the corporate accounts. Nova Edge's operating fund alone held more than enough to cover the $15,000 request 10 times over. She scrolled through transaction history. Payroll runs, vendor payments, equipment leases, all clean, all consistent. No overdrafts, no suspicious activity. Nothing that would justify being treated like a stranger, let alone a suspect. Still, a nagging question stuck with her. Why me? She called customer service, hoping for a simple explanation, a system error, a miscommunication, maybe even a temporary hold she hadn't noticed. But after 20 minutes on hold, 3 transfers between departments, and a script-reading representative who kept saying, "I understand your concern, but I can't override internal security protocols," she hung up. The conversation hadn't clarified anything. It had only confirmed her suspicion. This wasn't about her account. It was about how they saw her. That afternoon, she asked her head of operations, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya, who had been with her since year 2, if she'd ever had issues withdrawing cash from First Meridian. Priya frowned. "Actually, yeah. Last year I tried to pull $8,000 for a team off-site. They made me wait 2 days and call my authorized contact. I'm the CFO of this company, Elena. Who's more authorized than me?" Elena's stomach tightened. "Did you say anything?" "I complained," Priya said with a dry laugh. "They apologized and said it was a one-time anomaly, but I noticed something weird. They only gave me trouble when I came in alone. If I brought a male colleague, even just as a witness, they processed it right away." That detail hit hard. Elena thought back to the branch, how Derek's posture had shifted the moment she mentioned the amount, how his eyes had flicked toward the security camera like he was bracing for trouble. She hadn't imagined it. There was a pattern. She spent the next few hours digging, not through public records but through trusted networks. She reached out to a former intern who now worked at a financial compliance firm. Over a quiet coffee and a promise of confidentiality, the young woman leaned in and said, "First Meridian rolled out a new fraud detection AI last year. It's supposed to flag unusual behavior, but insiders say it's trained mostly on data from older, male account holders. Women under 40, especially entrepreneurs with irregular cash flows, keep getting mislabeled as high risk. They know it's happening. They just haven't fixed it." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office AC. It wasn't malice, it was laziness. A system built on outdated assumptions, left unchecked because the people it hurt weren't loud enough or powerful enough to make noise. But she was both. Later that evening, long after the office emptied, Elena stayed behind. The city lights flickered outside her window as she opened a secure folder labeled Vendor Relations. Buried in an old email chain from a recruiting agency that had once worked with First Meridian. She found it. A leaked internal memo. It wasn't marked confidential, but it might as well have been. The subject line read, "Behavioral Risk Scoring Adjustments, Q3 Update." She read slowly. The document outlined how the bank's algorithm assigned higher risk scores to accounts with non-traditional income patterns, a term that, in practice, meant freelancers, gig workers, and founders like her. Worse, it noted that female primary account holders under 45 were automatically subjected to additional verification layers, even for in-branch transactions. The justification? Historical anomaly clustering. In plain English, they assumed women like her were more likely to be scammed, or to scam the bank themselves. Elena closed the laptop. Her hands weren't shaking. They were steady, too steady. That was the moment she stopped seeing this as a personal slight and started seeing it as a systemic failure, one that had likely humiliated dozens, maybe hundreds of people just trying to manage their own money. She thought about the supplier in Detroit again. He hadn't asked for a bank guarantee or a credit check. He'd asked for trust, and now, because of a flawed system hiding behind the word policy, she couldn't give it to him. But more than that, she thought about every woman who'd walked into that branch. Maybe a single mom trying to pay a contractor in cash, a small business owner covering payroll, a freelancer collecting payment for months of work, and been made to feel like a criminal for wanting access to what was rightfully hers. Elena hadn't just been denied a withdrawal. She'd been reminded that in some rooms her success still looked suspicious. The next morning, she didn't go back to the bank. Instead, she called a meeting with her leadership team. Not a crisis meeting. She kept her tone calm, factual, but a strategic one. "We're evaluating our banking relationships," she said. Not because of rates or fees, because of respect. Her team listened. They'd all faced similar moments. Being talked over in meetings, having their expertise questioned, being mistaken for assistance. They understood what this was really about. By noon, Elena had drafted a list. Every account Nova Edge held with First Meridian. Payroll, operating expenses, client escrow funds, corporate credit lines, all of it. Over $18 million in active balances. She also noted her personal holdings, savings, investment-linked accounts, even the safety deposit box she'd rented for company documents. Then she did something quiet but powerful. She scheduled a call with a regional director at a different bank, one known for working with startups and founder-led companies. She didn't threaten. She didn't rant. She simply said, "We're looking for a banking partner who sees us as people, not data points. Can you be that?" The answer was yes, and fast, but Elena wasn't done. Before making any moves, she wanted to be sure. So she filed a formal complaint, not with social media, not with a lawyer yet, but with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Just a clear, factual letter. Date, time, location, names, what was requested, what was denied, and why it felt discriminatory. She attached screenshots of her account history and the relevant section of the bank's own customer agreement, which stated that verified account holders may withdraw available funds in person without delay. She hit send. No fanfare, no press release, just truth documented. That night, she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Not just the inconvenience, but the erosion of dignity. It's one thing to be told you can't do something because you lack the means. It's another to be told you can't do something you've already earned, simply because someone decided you don't look like you belong. But as she sat in her quiet apartment, sipping tea and watching rain slide down the window, she also felt something else. Resolve. This wasn't the end of her story with First Meridian. It was the beginning of something bigger. Because if they wouldn't recognize her today, she'd make sure they, and others like them, couldn't ignore people like her tomorrow. And she knew exactly where to start. Elena didn't rush. That was the thing people often misunderstood about her. She wasn't the type to explode in anger or fire off a viral tweet the second something went wrong. Her strength wasn't in noise, it was in timing. And right now, timing was everything. 2 days after the withdrawal denial, she walked into her weekly leadership huddle with a calm expression and a single sheet of paper. No dramatics. No raised voices. Just facts. "We're moving all Nova Edge accounts to Horizon Trust by Friday," she said, sliding the document across the table. Payroll, operations, client funds, everything. Her team didn't gasp. They didn't even look surprised. They'd seen the memo she'd shared the night before. The one outlining First Meridian's biased risk algorithm. The one that quietly flagged people like them as suspicious just for being who they were. They'd felt that sting before in boardrooms and bank lobbies and investor pitches. This wasn't just business. It was personal. Priya, her CFO, nodded slowly. "Horizon's already pre-approved our corporate structure. They'll have everything ready by Thursday. Payroll won't skip a beat." "Good," Elena said. "And let's notify our top 10 clients, not as a complaint, but as a heads up. Frame it as part of our values alignment initiative. We're choosing partners who see us as humans, not risk scores." That was the key. She wasn't making this about revenge. She was making it about respect. And in the world of tech, where trust was currency, that message traveled fast. By Wednesday, 3 other founders had reached out. One ran a sustainable fashion brand. Another led a mental health app startup. The third was a clean energy engineer who'd just closed a Series A. All of them had stories: frozen accounts, denied wire requests, tellers who asked, "Are you sure this is your account?" Even when they showed up with IDs and login codes. When Elena quietly shared what she was doing, they didn't hesitate. "If you're leaving," one said, "we're right behind you." It wasn't a coordinated protest. It wasn't a boycott. It was something quieter and far more powerful. It was a vote with their money. And in banking, that kind of vote echoes. Meanwhile, Elena made one more call. Not to a lawyer, not to a reporter, but to an old friend who wrote for a respected business magazine. They'd known each other since grad school, back when both were scraping by on instant noodles and big dreams. Over coffee, Elena laid it out, not as a rant but as a story. "I'm not asking you to write about me," she said. "But if you've ever wondered why so many founders, especially women and people of color, feel alienated by traditional finance, this is a real example. And I think people should know." Her friend listened, took notes, didn't promise anything, but before they parted, she said, "This isn't just your story. It's a pattern. And patterns deserve attention." Elena went home that night and did something small but symbolic. She logged into her personal First Meridian account and scheduled a transfer of $1 to Horizon Trust. Just $1. A test, a signal. The system processed it instantly. No flags, no delays. She smiled faintly. Of course it did. $1 wasn't risky. Only ambition was. On Thursday, Nova Edge's entire financial ecosystem began its quiet migration. Payroll switched over without a glitch. Vendor payments rerouted. Client retainers flowed into new accounts. By Friday morning, over $18 million had left First Meridian, not in a dramatic dump, but in a smooth, professional transition that spoke louder than any angry letter ever could. That same day, Elena walked into the same branch on Elm Street. Not to withdraw cash, not to complain, just to close her personal savings account, the one she'd opened 12 years ago with her first real paycheck. She didn't ask for Derek, she didn't need to. She handed her paperwork to Tina, the teller from that first morning, who looked startled to see her again. "I'm closing this account," Elena said gently. "Everything's been transferred." Tina hesitated, then whispered, "I'm really sorry about what happened." Elena met her eyes. "It wasn't your fault. But systems only change when people speak up, even quietly." She signed the forms, received her final balance in a certified check, and left. No fanfare, no confrontation, Just closure. But the ripple was already spreading. By Monday, whispers turned into conversations. A venture capital firm pulled its fund administration. A local co-working space switched its business accounts. Even a mid-sized law firm, known for its old-school loyalty to First Meridian, quietly began shopping for alternatives. None of them shouted about it. They just acted. And in finance, action speaks in millions. Inside First Meridian's corporate offices, alarms started going off. Not literal ones, but the kind that show up in dashboards. Unusual outflow. Key client attrition. Negative sentiment spikes in customer surveys. Someone finally connected the dots. Someone remembered the woman in the navy coat who'd asked for $15,000 and left with nothing but a quiet warning. Derek got called into a meeting with regional compliance. He stammered through his version of events, insisting he'd followed protocol. But the higher-ups weren't buying it. Especially not after a draft of an upcoming article landed on the desk of the bank's chief risk officer. An article titled, "When Banks Don't Recognize Their Own CEOs." Elena still hadn't gone public. She hadn't posted a single thing online, but her story was out there, moving through trusted channels, gaining weight with every person who said, "Yeah, that happened to me too." And that was the real power of what she'd done. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't sued. She'd simply removed her trust, and in doing so showed others they could too. Back at Nova Edge, Elena stood by the window of her office, watching the city pulse below. Her phone buzzed. A text from the clean energy founder. "We're out. Horizon's onboarding us Monday. Thank you for lighting the way." She didn't reply right away. She just let the words sit with her. This wasn't about winning. It was about making space for fairness, for dignity, for the simple right to walk into a bank and be seen for who you really are. And as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Elena knew one thing for certain. The next chapter wouldn't be written in a bank lobby. It would be built in boardrooms, in startups, in communities tired of being treated like risks instead of people. She turned back to her desk, opened a new document and typed a single line. What if banking worked for everyone? Then she began to build something better. The article dropped on a Tuesday morning. No hype, no teaser, just a clean headline on a well-respected business site. When Banks Don't Recognize Their Own CEOs. By lunchtime, it was everywhere. It didn't name Elena outright at first. It referred to her as a founder of a mid-sized tech firm, but anyone in the startup world knew exactly who it was. The details were too specific. The $15,000 cash request, the decade-long banking history, the quiet transfer of $18 million in corporate funds. And then came the kicker. The leaked internal memo showing how First Meridian's fraud detection system disproportionately flagged women under 40, especially entrepreneurs, as high risk based on nothing more than their age, gender, and non-traditional income patterns. People didn't just read it. They shared it. Not with outrage hashtags, but with quiet recognition. This happened to me. My sister went through this last year. I thought it was just me. Within hours, the comments section filled with stories. A bakery owner in Portland denied a $5,000 withdrawal for a new oven. A freelance designer in Atlanta held for 2 days when trying to access her own savings. A black physician in Chicago asked to prove she owned her account, despite showing her ID and medical license. The pattern was undeniable, and suddenly it had a face even if that face wasn't named. First Meridian's PR team scrambled. By noon, their social media accounts were flooded. Their stock, which had been steady for months, dipped 3% by 1 p.m. By close of trading, it was down 7%. Analysts started asking questions on earnings calls. Reporters called corporate headquarters. The bank issued a bland statement. "We take all customer concerns seriously and are reviewing our protocols to ensure fairness and compliance." But the damage wasn't in the numbers. It was in the trust. And trust, once cracked, doesn't glue back easily. Elena didn't post the article. She didn't quote-tweet it or add commentary. She let it breathe on its own. Because the story wasn't really about her. It was about everyone who'd ever been made to feel like a stranger in their own financial life. But she didn't stay silent either. 2 days after the piece ran, she hosted a small gathering, not a press conference, not a staged event, but a real conversation. She invited a handful of journalists, a few founders, and a representative from a nonprofit that advocated for fair lending practices. They met in Nova Edge's sunlit conference room with coffee, pastries, and no cameras rolling at first. "I'm not here to destroy a bank," Elena said, sitting casually in a chair, not behind a podium. "I'm here because I believe systems should serve people, not the other way around. And right now, too many people are being failed by systems that claim to protect them." She spoke plainly. No jargon, no corporate speak. Just truth. She explained how she'd tried to resolve it quietly, how she'd given First Meridian every chance to correct the error, and how their silence, and their flawed algorithm, had forced her hand. Then she turned the floor over to others. The bakery owner talked about nearly losing her lease because she couldn't access her emergency fund. The freelance designer described being treated like a criminal while trying to pay her mother's medical bill. It wasn't performative. It was human. A reporter asked, "What do you want to happen now?" Elena didn't say, "I want them to fire the manager," or "I want an apology." Instead, she said, "I want transparency. I want banks to audit their algorithms for bias, just like they audit their finances. And I want customers to know they have the right to ask, why was I flagged? What data was used? Who decided this was suspicious?" That afternoon, video clips from the conversation began circulating. Not edited for drama, just raw, thoughtful moments. One clip showed Elena saying, "Money isn't just numbers. It's dignity. It's safety. It's the ability to take care of the people you love, and no one should have to beg for access to what's already theirs." The quote went viral, not in a flashy way, but in the quiet, spreading way that changes minds. By the end of the week, regulators took notice. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau announced it was opening a formal inquiry into potential discriminatory practices in automated banking systems. Other banks started issuing statements of their own, pledging to review their risk models. One even launched a public dashboard showing how their algorithms were tested for fairness. First Meridian, meanwhile, was in full damage control. Derek, the branch manager, was placed on administrative leave, not fired but sidelined while internal reviews took place. Corporate sent a personal apology letter to Elena, along with an offer to waive all fees for a year and assign her a dedicated relationship manager. She didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because the offer missed the point entirely. This was never about perks. It was about principle. What surprised even Elena was how fast the ripple grew. Within 10 days, over $200 million in corporate and high-net-worth deposits had quietly left First Meridian. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but steadily, like water finding, a new path after a dam cracks, and then came the most unexpected turn. A group of junior employees from First Meridian's tech and compliance teams reached out to Elena, not through official channels, but through personal LinkedIn messages. They thanked her. One wrote, "We've been raising concerns about the algorithm for months. No one listened. You made them listen." Another said, "You gave us the courage to speak up internally. Change is finally happening here, slow but real." Elena replied to each one, "Not as a CEO, but as a person." "Keep pushing," she wrote. Real change starts from the inside, too. She also used the moment to plant a new seed. At a small tech summit the following week, she announced Nova Edge would be partnering with Horizon Trust and a nonprofit fintech lab to develop an open-source framework for ethical banking algorithms. Transparent, auditable, and bias-tested from day one. It wouldn't replace banks, she explained. It would give them a better blueprint. The announcement didn't make headlines, but in the right circles it mattered, because it wasn't about tearing something down. It was about building something better. Back in her office one evening, Elena scrolled through messages from strangers. Thank yous, shared stories, offers to collaborate. She paused on one from a college student studying computer science. "I want to build systems that include people, not exclude them. You showed me it's possible." She closed her laptop, walked to the window, and watched the city lights flicker on. The storm had passed, but the ground was different now, softer, more fertile, and she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a conversation that needed to be had, not just in boardrooms, but in every place where people's lives meet systems that claim to serve them. She turned off the light and headed home, not as a victor, but as someone who'd simply refused to stay quiet when silence would have been easier. And in that quiet refusal, She'd helped change everything. Months passed. The headlines faded. The stock prices stabilized. Life, as it always does, moved on. But for Elena, the quiet after the storm wasn't an ending. It was a different kind of beginning. She didn't become a celebrity. She didn't start a podcast or launch a book tour. She went back to work just like always. But something had shifted, not in her, but in the world around her. People looked at her differently now. Not because she'd won some grand battle, but because she'd shown what it looked like to stand your ground without losing your humanity. Her story started showing up in unexpected places. A professor at a business school in Chicago reached out to ask if he could use her case in his ethics class. Not as a cautionary tale, he said, but as a model of principled leadership. Elena agreed on one condition, that students also hear from the bank employees who'd spoken up from within. Real change, she told him, is never just one person. Around the same time, a small credit union in Ohio redesigned its entire verification process after reading the article. They even sent her a handwritten note. "You reminded us who we're here for." She kept it pinned to her bulletin board, right next to sketches of Nova Edge's next product. First Meridian never fully recovered, at least not in the way they'd hoped. They rolled out a new inclusive banking initiative, hired a chief ethics officer, and published their first algorithmic fairness report. It was a start. But trust, once broken, doesn't return with a press release. Corporate clients kept leaving. Founders chose other banks, and though the branch on Elm Street still stood, it felt quieter, emptier, like a room where the air had changed and no one knew how to fill it again. Elena never sued. She didn't need to. The market had spoken louder than any courtroom ever could. One crisp autumn morning, nearly 6 months after that first denial, she found herself back in the neighborhood. She wasn't planning to go in. She just happened to be meeting a client nearby. But as she passed the familiar glass doors of the First Meridian branch, she paused. Not out of anger. Not out of nostalgia, just curiosity. She walked in. The interior was the same hum of printers, the same faint scent of coffee and paper. But the faces were different. Derek was gone. Tina still worked there, but she was now training new tellers. When she saw Elena, her eyes widened slightly, then softened. "Hi," Tina said, stepping forward. "Can I help you with something?" Elena smiled. "Actually, yes. I'd like to close my safety deposit box. I moved everything out last week, but I never came in to finalize it." Tina nodded quickly. "Of course. I'll get the form." While she filled it out, Elena glanced around. A young woman, maybe early 20s, was helping an elderly man with a deposit. She spoke slowly, patiently, making sure he understood each step. No suspicion, no hesitation, just care. It gave Elena hope. She signed the last line, handed the key to Tina, and said, "Thank you." Tina hesitated, then spoke softly. "You know, after you left, we had a lot of hard conversations here. About who we serve. About what risk really means. It's not perfect, but we're trying. I believe you," Elena said. And she did. Not because the system was fixed, but because someone inside it was finally asking the right questions. She walked out into the sunlight, the city alive around her. No fanfare, no cameras. Just a woman closing a chapter so she could write the next one. Back at Nova Edge, things were humming. The ethical banking framework she'd helped launch was gaining traction, used now by 3 regional banks and 2 credit unions. It wasn't flashy tech. It didn't make headlines. But it was working. Real people were getting fairer treatment because of it. And then there was the supplier in Detroit, the one she'd originally needed the $15,000 for. He'd heard what happened. When she finally made it out to his workshop with the cash, from her new bank, no questions asked, he shook her hand and said, "You didn't just keep your word. You kept your dignity. That matters more." They launched the prototype together 2 months later. It sold out in 3 weeks. But the biggest change wasn't in products or policies. It was in conversations. At dinner parties, over coffee, and Slack channels and boardrooms, people started asking, "Does this system treat everyone fairly? Who does this policy actually protect? What voices are we missing here?" Elena hadn't started those questions, but her story had given others permission to ask them. One evening, as she sat on her apartment balcony watching the sunset paint the skyline gold, her phone buzzed. It was a message from a young founder she'd never met, a woman who'd just raised her first seed round. "I read your story before my bank meeting today," she wrote. "When they hesitated on my withdrawal request, I calmly showed them my docs and said, 'I trust you'll treat me like the business owner I am.' They processed it right away. Thank you for showing us how to stand tall without shouting." Elena read it twice. Then she set her phone down and took a slow breath. That was the real victory. Not the money moved, not the headlines, but the quiet courage passed from one person to another. She never wanted to be a symbol. She just wanted to be seen. And in trying to reclaim that for herself, she'd helped others do the same. Now when she walked into a bank, any bank, she didn't brace for suspicion. She walked in with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth wasn't up for debate. And more importantly, she made sure her team, her clients, and even strangers on the internet knew theirs wasn't either. The world hadn't changed overnight. Bias still existed. Flawed systems still operated in the shadows. But cracks had formed. Light was getting in. And people like Elena, calm, clear-eyed, unwilling to accept that's just how it is, were the ones widening those cracks, one decision at a time. As night fell and the city lights blinked on, she thought about the framed photo on her desk, the one of her first team in that tiny garage. They'd built something real, not perfect, but honest. And that honesty, she realized, was the most powerful currency of all. She went inside, poured a glass of water, and opened her laptop. A new email sat in her inbox. Invitation, National FinTech Ethics Advisory Panel. She read it, then typed a simple reply. "I'd be honored to join." Then she leaned back, smiled to herself, and got back to work, building a future where no one would ever have to prove they belonged in their own bank again.